On the morning of July 10, 1940, a formation of German bombers crossed the English Channel and hit a convoy of merchant ships moving through the Strait of Dover. It was a routine operation by Luftwaffe standards. A probe, really a test of British nerve. The Royal Air Force scrambled fighters to intercept. Both sides lost planes. Both sides pulled back. Nobody called it a battle yet. By October 31st, when the last German aircraft turned for France and the skies over England went quiet, roughly 4,000 men had died in the air above southern England. One of the greatest aerial campaigns in the history of warfare had been fought and decided, and the course of the Second World War had pivoted on a question neither side had fully expected to answer. What happened when the most powerful air force in the world flew into a trap it didn't know existed? This is the story of the Battle of Britain, told from both sides of that sky. By the summer of 1940, Adolf Hitler had done something that Napoleon and the Kaiser had failed to do. He had conquered continental Europe. In 6 weeks, Germany had smashed through Belgium, the Netherlands, and France. The British Expeditionary Force, more than 300,000 men, had barely escaped through the beaches at Dunkirk, leaving most of their heavy equipment behind in the sand. France signed an armistice on June 22nd. Britain's closest ally was out of the war. Hitler expected Britain to ask for terms. Winston Churchill, who had become Prime Minister on May 10th, the same day Germany launched its assault on France, had no intention of doing any such thing. His response to Hitler's peace overtures was essentially silence, punctuated by one of the most defiant speeches in the English language, delivered to the House of Commons. "We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall fight in the fields and in the streets. We shall fight in the hills. We shall never surrender." So Hitler ordered an invasion. The operation was called Sea Lion, a planned amphibious assault across the English Channel using converted river barges. The German army began assembling invasion fleets in the ports of occupied France and Belgium. The Wehrmacht generals studied the tidal charts and the beach gradients of the English coast. The logistics were enormous, the risks were real, and every officer involved understood that the whole thing depended on a single condition being met first. The Royal Air Force had to be destroyed. The Royal Navy controlled the surface of the channel. Any German invasion fleet that crossed without air cover would be torn apart by British warships before it reached the beach. So the Luftwaffe, Germany's air force, the most combat tested in the world, was given the job of sweeping the RAF from the sky. Hermann Goering, the Luftwaffe's commander-in-chief, was not worried. He told Hitler it could be done in 4 weeks. To understand the Luftwaffe's confidence, you have to understand what it had accomplished. In the previous 4 years, German airmen had fought over Spain in the Civil War, crushed the Polish Air Force in 1939, and torn through French and British squadrons during the campaign in the West. The Stuka dive bomber had become a symbol of German power, its screaming sirens as psychologically devastating as the bombs it dropped. The Messerschmitt Bf-109, Germany's primary single-engine fighter, was arguably the finest fighter aircraft in the world when it entered service in 1937. By 1940, its pilots were the most experienced in any air force on Earth. The man commanding them was a figure from a different era, Hermann Goering, who in 1918 had commanded the Richthofen Flying Circus, the legendary fighter wing built by Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron. Goering was the decorated World War I ace, a founding figure of the Nazi movement, and by 1940, the second most powerful man in Germany. He was also, by most accounts, vain, politically calculating, and increasingly detached from the operational realities of the air campaign he was about to wage. His intelligence services were poor. His understanding of British air defenses was built on guesswork and wishful thinking, and he had made a promise to Hitler that he had no reliable way to keep. For the actual fighting, the Luftwaffe organized its forces into 3 air fleets called Luftflotten. Luftflotte II, under Albert Kesselring, operated from bases in Belgium and northeastern France. Luftflotte III, under Hugo Sperle, flew from northwestern France. Luftwaffe 5, a smaller force, operated from Norway and Denmark to threaten northern England. Together, these three fleets put roughly 2,500 aircraft into the campaign, over 1,000 bombers and over 1,000 fighters. The core of the bomber force was a trio of twin-engine medium bombers, the Henkel HE-111, the Danae DO-17, and the Junkers Ju-88. They were capable aircraft, proven in Spain and Poland, but they had been designed to support ground armies in blitzkrieg operations, not to conduct sustained independent campaigns against a defended island nation. Their bomb loads were modest by the standards of what strategic bombing would become. Their defensive armament was limited, and crucially, they needed fighter escort to survive against determined opposition. That escort fell to the Bf-109. It was a superb aircraft, fast, maneuverable, well armed, but it had been designed for a short-range war of support on the continent. Flying from its bases in the Pas-de-Calais, the closest point of occupied France to England, a Bf-109 had roughly 10 minutes of combat time over London before it had to turn back for France or risk running out of fuel over the Channel. Bomber crews who needed sustained protection on deep penetration missions found their escorts peeling away just when things got dangerous, leaving them to face the RAF fighters alone. The Germans also deployed the Messerschmitt Bf-110, a twin-engine heavy fighter that Göring had envisioned as a long-range escort, what the Luftwaffe called a Zerstörer, or destroyer. In practice, the Bf-110 was too slow and too unmaneuverable to survive against Spitfires and Hurricanes. It turned out to need its own fighter escort, which rather defeated the purpose. The Junkers Ju-87 Stutka proved similarly vulnerable. The RAF shot them down so efficiently in the early weeks that Göring eventually pulled the Stutkas from the main campaign entirely. None of this was apparent in June 1940. The Luftwaffe's pilots had reason to believe in themselves. They had won everywhere they had fought. What they didn't know, what no one on the German side fully grasped, was what was waiting for them on the other side of the Channel. If the Luftwaffe's strength was its pilots, the RAF's strength was its system, and the system had been built by one man who almost no one outside the Air Ministry had ever heard of. Air Chief Marshal Sir Hugh Dowding had commanded RAF Fighter Command since 1936. He was 58 years old in 1940, socially reserved to the point of awkwardness, and known within the Air Force by a nickname that tells you almost everything you need to know about his personality: Stuffy. He operated with compulsory retirement constantly hanging over him. His superiors had been trying to push him out since before the war started. He had fought them at every turn, not out of vanity or self-interest, because he believed, with complete conviction, that he was the only person who understood what it was going to take to defend Britain from the air. He was right. Through the late 1930s, while the Luftwaffe was winning wars in Spain and Poland, Dowding was building something that had never existed before: an integrated national air defense network. At its foundation was radar, what the British called radio direction finding, or RDF. A chain of steel transmitter towers had been erected along the south and east coasts of England, capable of detecting approaching aircraft from up to 80 miles away while they were still over the Channel. It was the first radar early warning network ever constructed, known as Chain Home, and it gave the RAF the single most precious commodity in aerial warfare: time. But radar alone was not the system. The signal from Chain Home could tell you that aircraft were approaching. It couldn't tell you exactly where they were going once they crossed the coast, and it had serious trouble detecting low-flying aircraft. For that, Dowding relied on 30,000 volunteers of the Observer Corps, civilians who stood in observation posts across southern England, tracked incoming aircraft visually, and reported by telephone to a network of operations rooms. Between the radar chain and the observation corps, an unbroken picture of the air battle over Britain could be assembled, updated, and transmitted to Fighter Command's headquarters at Bentley Priory outside London in as little as 4 minutes. What this meant in practice was that the RAF could put fighters into the air only when they were needed and direct them precisely to where the enemy was. Without the system, Fighter Command would have had to fly continuous standing patrols, burning fuel and exhausting pilots looking for enemy formations that might never appear. With the system, squadrons could be scrambled at the last moment, conserving resources and meeting the enemy with maximum efficiency. The interception rate, the percentage of sorties that actually made contact with the enemy, reached roughly 90% during the battle. Before the Dowding system existed, 30 to 50% was considered excellent. The Germans knew the radar towers existed. German reconnaissance aircraft had photographed them, but Göring's intelligence staff fundamentally misunderstood what they were looking at. They believed British radar was relatively unsophisticated. They didn't grasp how deeply integrated it was, how the towers, the observer corps, the operations rooms, and the radio-equipped fighters formed a single organism, each part dependent on the other, the whole greater than the sum of its pieces. There was one Luftwaffe officer, Signals Chief General Wolfgang Martini, who understood what the chain-home towers really meant and argued repeatedly that destroying them should be the campaign's first priority. He was largely ignored. Göring would eventually dismiss continued attacks on radar sites as a waste of effort, arguing that the towers were too difficult to destroy. It was one of the most consequential decisions of the entire battle. RAF Fighter Command entered the battle with two frontline fighters, and the difference between them would shape how the air war was fought. The Hawker Hurricane was older, sturdier, and somewhat slower than its partner. It was a transitional design, partly fabric covered, drawing on construction principles that traced back to the biplanes of the First World War. But it was reliable, easy to repair, and in the hands of a trained pilot, it was a formidable gun platform. Hurricane squadrons outnumbered Spitfire squadrons roughly 2 to 1, and the tactical decision was made early to direct Hurricanes primarily against the German bombers, while the faster, more agile Spitfires took on the German fighter escort. The Supermarine Spitfire was something else. Designed by Reginald Mitchell, who had died of cancer in 1937 before he could see what his aircraft would accomplish. The Spitfire's elliptical wing and Rolls-Royce Merlin engine produced a combination of speed, climb rate, and maneuverability that could match the Bf-109 on nearly equal terms. German fighter pilots who encountered Spitfires in the summer of 1940 remembered the experience. The Spitfire was faster at altitude and turned tighter in a horizontal circle. The Bf-109 had one advantage. It could push into a dive without engine cutout, while early Spitfires and Hurricanes with their float carburetors momentarily lost power when negative G-forces interrupted fuel flow. In a dogfight, small things determined whether you lived. At the height of the battle, Fighter Command had approximately 749 serviceable aircraft against roughly 2,550 Luftwaffe aircraft. The numbers looked overwhelming. What the numbers didn't capture was the structural advantage Dowding had built into the fight. The RAF was fighting over its own territory, which meant pilots who survived being shot down could often return to their squadrons within hours. A German pilot who bailed out over England was a prisoner of war. A German aircraft that went down in the Channel was simply gone. British aircraft production, driven hard by Minister of Aircraft Production Lord Beaverbrook, consistently outpaced Luftwaffe replacement rates throughout the summer. By September 1940, Fighter Command actually had more serviceable aircraft than it had had at the end of June. The battle would not be lost for lack of planes. The one resource that could not be replaced quickly enough was pilots. The campaign began formally on August 13, 1940, a date the Luftwaffe called Adlertag, Eagle Day. Göring's plan was to destroy Fighter Command's airfields, control centers, and supporting infrastructure in southern England in 4 days, forcing the RAF to commit its remaining aircraft to a battle of attrition it couldn't survive. The bombers would smash the airfields. The Bf-109s would sweep the Spitfires and Hurricanes from the sky. Within a month, the RAF would cease to exist as an effective fighting force, and Operation Sea Lion could proceed. Eagle Day itself was a logistical mess. Poor weather forced the cancellation of morning raids, but the orders didn't reach all units in time. Bombers set out without their fighter escort. Fighters flew their assigned missions without knowing the bombers they were supposed to protect had turned back. German aircraft arrived over England piecemeal, confused and vulnerable. The RAF's radar network tracked them every mile of the way. Over the following 2 weeks, the Luftwaffe intensified the assault. The attack shifted decisively toward Fighter Command's sector stations, the airfields that served as the nerve centers of the Dowding system, where operations rooms directed squadrons in real time. Biggin Hill was hit so many times that ground crews worked in the rubble between raids, repairing telephone lines and clearing craters so the operations room could continue functioning. Manston Airfield, on the tip of Kent, took such a battering that it was temporarily abandoned. Hornchurch, Kenley, and North Weald were all hit hard. August 18th, a Sunday, became known as the hardest day. Both sides put everything they had into the sky. The RAF shot down twice as many Luftwaffe aircraft in the air as it lost, but German bombs destroyed dozens of British aircraft on the ground. Total losses on both sides were roughly equal, and for the first time the numbers began to tell a grimmer story for the defenders. The last week of August and the first week of September were the most dangerous of the entire battle. Fighter Command was under genuine pressure. The sector stations were damaged but had not yet been put out of action. Experienced pilots were being killed or wounded faster than replacements could be trained. Replacement pilots were arriving at squadrons with as little as 10 hours of operational experience in their logbooks. Some lasted days. The ground crews who kept the aircraft flying were working around the clock, sleeping where they could, eating cold food in the shadow of bomb-damaged hangars. On the ground, the women and men of the Dowding system, WAAF plotters, radar operators, observer corps volunteers, worked their shifts and then worked the next shift when the person who was supposed to relieve them didn't arrive. The whole apparatus was fraying at the edges. It was not yet broken. On the night of August 24th, a formation of German bombers that had lost their way dropped their loads over central London. It was, by most accounts, accidental. The crews were supposed to hit oil storage tanks and industrial targets well outside the city. But bombs fell on residential streets, churches, and shops in the East End. Civilians died. Churchill ordered retaliation. On the night of August 25th, RAF Bomber Command sent 80 aircraft to Berlin. The raid did little physical damage. The bombs fell scattered across the city, some in fields, some on suburban streets, but the psychological damage was considerable. Göring had promised Hitler, explicitly and publicly, that no British aircraft would ever reach Berlin. Now they had. Hitler was furious. He ordered the Luftwaffe to shift its attacks from RAF airfields and sector stations to the City of London. On September 7, 1940, 348 German bombers, escorted by 617 fighters, crossed the Channel in the largest aerial armada England had ever seen. They came in two waves, the first hitting at 4:14 in the afternoon, the second arriving as darkness fell and continuing until nearly dawn. The target was the London docks, the East End, the warehouses, the wharves along the Thames that fed the city. The fires that night were visible from 60 miles away. It was, from a German strategic perspective, one of the worst decisions of the entire war. The sector stations Fighter Command had been so desperately defending were suddenly no longer targets. The operations rooms that had been bombed and repaired and bombed again were given an unexpected reprieve. The pilots and ground crews who had been running on fumes and willpower were given time to breathe, to sleep, to regroup. Within days, the RAF that had been approaching the edge of its operational limits was rebuilding its strength. Dowding used the pause to rest those most exhausted squadrons and bring fresh units south to reinforce 11 Group. Production of new aircraft continued to outpace losses. The shift to bombing London was not purely the result of Hitler's rage over Berlin, though that played a role. Goring had also convinced himself that attacking London would force Fighter Command to commit its remaining aircraft to a final battle of attrition, that the RAF would have to defend the city or lose it, and that in defending it, the last of its pilots would be destroyed. His intelligence staff had been telling him for weeks that Fighter Command was finished, operating on its last reserves. The famous joke among German pilots was that every time they appeared over England, they were fighting the last 50 Spitfires, because no matter how many they shot down, more appeared. German intelligence had persistently, catastrophically underestimated both the scale and the resilience of British aircraft production. The last 50 Spitfires always came back. September 15, 1940 is remembered in Britain as Battle of Britain Day, and it earned the name. The Luftwaffe launched its heaviest coordinated attacks of the entire campaign. Nearly 1,000 aircraft, 348 bombers escorted by 617 fighters, assembled over France and turned toward England in two great waves. The target was London, its rail terminals, its docks, its bridges. The intent was to smash British morale so completely that either the civilian population would demand peace or the RAF would be forced into a decisive final engagement. The Dowding system tracked them from the moment they formed up over France. Park scrambled every squadron in 11 Group. For the first time, Lee-Mallory's 12 Group was available to reinforce in significant numbers. The rested squadrons Dowding had cycled north were now coming back south, fresh and ready. Winston Churchill happened to be visiting the 11 Group operations room at Uxbridge that day. He sat beside Park and watched as the plotting table filled with markers. At one point, he asked Park how many reserves were left. Park told him there were none. Every squadron Fighter Command had available was in the air. Both waves were met with fierce resistance all the way to London and all the way back. The Polish Squadron 303, flying out of RAF Northolt, was among the units that intercepted the afternoon wave over the Thames estuary. The Poles had only been declared operational on August 31st, arriving late to the battle, initially greeted with skepticism from RAF commanders who doubted whether foreign pilots, accustomed to different aircraft and procedures, could operate effectively within the Dowding system. Within days of becoming operational, No. 303 Squadron had dispelled every doubt. Flying Hurricanes, attacking in close formation, getting nearer to the enemy before opening fire than most RAF doctrine recommended, the Polish pilots demonstrated a ferocity that impressed even the veterans around them. They were not fighting for a country that might be invaded. Their country had already been invaded, occupied, and brutalized. Every German aircraft they shot down was an act of revenge for Warsaw. By the end of September 15th, the Luftwaffe had lost 56 aircraft confirmed, with many more damaged. The RAF lost 26. But the number that mattered most was the number that didn't appear in any official count. The number of German aircrew who came back to their bases shaken, exhausted, and no longer certain they were winning. They had been promised the RAF was nearly finished. They had faced wave after wave of fighters, organized and directed with a precision they didn't understand. They had turned for France, knowing that whatever they had done to Britain that day had not been enough. 2 days later, Hitler postponed Operation Sea Lion indefinitely. On October 31st, the Daylight Campaign ended. The Battle of Britain was over. The 2,945 RAF aircrew who fought the battle came from 15 different nations. The largest foreign contingent was Polish, 145 pilots, about 5% of the Fighter Command's total strength, who between them claimed 203 enemy aircraft. On Battle of Britain Day itself, 1 in 5 of the pilots in the air was Polish. When Dowding wrote his official assessment of the campaign after the battle was over, he, who had initially been reluctant to deploy the Polish squadrons at all, skeptical of their ability to integrate into his system, wrote that he hesitated to say the outcome would have been the same without them. Number 303 Squadron, the Kosciuszko Squadron, became the highest scoring squadron of the entire battle in its confirmed kills per sortie rate, despite having entered the fight 2 months late. Their ace pilot, Josef Franczek, was a Czech who preferred to fly with the Poles. He finished the battle with 17 confirmed kills, the highest individual score of any pilot in the campaign. He died in October 1940 in a flying accident whose cause was never fully explained. Hermann Goering emerged from the battle diminished, beginning a long decline in Hitler's favor from which he never recovered. He had promised to win in 4 weeks. The battle lasted 16. Hugh Dowding was removed from command of Fighter Command in November 1940, less than a month after the battle ended. The men who removed him cited his management style, his unwillingness to play politics in the Air Ministry, and various disputes over tactics and resources that had been simmering through the summer. It was an extraordinary thing to do to the man who had just won the most consequential air battle in history. Dowding died in 1970 at the age of 87. His ashes are buried at Westminster Abbey. What the Battle of Britain decided was not the outcome of the Second World War. That would take 5 more years and the resources of the United States and the Soviet Union and the suffering of millions more people across the globe. What it decided was whether the war would have a free Britain in it, whether there would be a staging ground from which an eventual liberation of occupied Europe could begin, whether the one major democratic nation that had refused to negotiate with Hitler would survive to fight another day. The Luftwaffe had expected to fight exhausted men in a depleted service, defending a country already at the end of its strength. What it found instead was an invisible architecture, built years in advance by a quiet, difficult, undervalued man who had understood before anyone else what the war in the air was going to look like, that multiplied the effectiveness of every pilot who flew into it, that turned the defenders' knowledge of their own sky into a weapon, that made the most of everything Britain had. Both sides showed extraordinary courage in that summer sky. German bomber crews flew missions they knew were increasingly suicidal as the battle ground on. Fighter pilots on both sides climbed into their cockpits and flew toward each other every day, knowing some of them would not come back. The men who held the sector stations together under bombing, the Observer Corps volunteers standing in their posts counting aircraft overhead, the WAAF plotters moving their markers across illuminated maps. They were all part of the same thing. Churchill gave the battle its name on June 18, 1940, before a single shot had been fired in it. Then came the words he said afterward, in August, when the fighting was at its height. Words addressed to the men flying the Spitfires and Hurricanes, but meant really for everyone holding any part of the line. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. He was right, and the few were more numerous than the legend suggests. I'm Dave. Thanks for watching. If this kind of history matters to you, hit subscribe, leave a comment. I genuinely read them, and I'll see you in the next one.
Oh, Dave.